Barletta and Spadafora, a palace coup. The closing of the School of the Americas was the first no. I've already described the second no. It was my absolute refusal to help the Americans in Central America, capped off by my rejection of Oliver North's plans for us in Nicaragua. But there was one more incident, the murder of a government critic in a military plot against me within my inner circle, both of which led to the dismissal of Nicolas Ardito Barletta as president of Panama. The United States agreed in 1984 to support Barletta as president. Barletta had been living for a long time outside of Panama, working for the World Bank. He was a student of Secretary of State George Shultz, one of a number of U.S.-educated Latin American technocrats, like Carlos Salinas in Mexico, someone operating in the field of international economics, studying the foreign debt, things that mattered to the United States. For that reason, and with the patronage of Shultz, there was a campaign in favor of Barletta's sudden candidacy. This didn't bother me at all. In military command meetings, we had decided that it was a good idea for the civilians to take a stronger hand, especially in economic policy. We opposed Arnulfo Arias's candidacy from the Panamanista Party, and so did the Americans. The old Caudillo invited me to his beach house just before the election campaign and told me outright that one of his campaign promises would be to dismantle the military, the same thing he tried to do in 1968. With the support of the PDF and the PRD, Democratic Revolutionary Party, Barletta was elected by a narrow margin in 1984. That was what the Americans wanted. Arias complained that the election had been stolen from him, but his complaints were disregarded. The United States sent an official delegation to the inauguration. Among those attending was former President Jimmy Carter. With Barletta's presidency, I agreed that the military should take a less active role in economic and political affairs. Upon his inauguration, I told Barletta that we wanted to return to the barracks. With your election, I said, the country will dine on democracy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This was not to be. Barletta began to face criticism. There were general complaints that he was a terrible manager and a weak leader. He knew nothing about building consensus, neither in the legislative assembly nor among the people. Barletta started mouthing U.S. economic analysis, which said that countries like Panama needed to impose severe cost-cutting controls to curb the government debt. The International Monetary Fund, in concert with Reagan administration policy, was pushing deficit-cutting measures throughout the hemisphere. The result was certain to be the loss of hundreds, if not thousands, of civil service jobs. Instead of creating political alliances, negotiating and selling this to the legislature and the country, Barletta simply announced his support for the measures and remained aloof. He was highly criticized. Labor unions, especially those representing public employees, became restive, charging that he was surrendering Panamanian sovereignty to U.S. economic theory. His reaction was to run for cover, behind the support and prestige the military could offer him. But this was not the only problem. The political temperature was rising all around us. Barletta and I were both targets of someone who was plotting to undermine my leadership of the Panamanian Defense Forces. As reported in the book Our Man in Panama, with both the president and Noriega out of the country, Diaz Herrera decided to make the move he had been secretly contemplating since Noriega took over as comandante. He took the first steps toward overthrowing Noriega. I saw a great crisis coming. I thought the opposition was going to take great advantage of that death. So, with Noriega away, I tried to see if I could orchestrate something against Noriega himself, something inside the barracks and with the politicians at my side. I went out on a limb with the PRD and the armed forces to see if I could pull off a putsch against Noriega, Diaz Herrera recounted. On the morning of September 16, 1985, the news from home was a shock. Hugo Spadafora had been found murdered over the weekend in Chiriquí. I was out of the country in Europe for several weeks, attending a military naval affairs conference and traveling between England, Paris, and Switzerland. I immediately contacted Barletta at the presidential palace. He told me about his working plan to investigate the crime. I also spoke with a member of the Legislative Assembly, Alfredo Orange, who was a close friend of the Spadafora family. I assured him that the investigation would be carried out and that I would give it special attention on my return. Spadafora was a homegrown Panamanian who had studied medicine in Italy, then ran off to Africa as a militant in the Angolan War of Liberation prior to Angola's independence from Portugal in 1975. When he came home to Panama, he joined a local leftist student movement. He took the code name Dr. Shivago. Spadafora became an informant for the National Guard. Investigators from the National Department of Investigation were able to identify and disband the leftist organization he belonged to, based on the information he provided. It was during his informant phase that I had my first contact with Spadafora. I was serving at the time as captain in charge of an elite infantry brigade called the Pumas de Tocumen. Over the years, I got to know him well and helped advance his career when I could. I saw him rise from youthful informant to vice minister of health to the head of a Panamanian brigade that volunteered to help the Sandinistas overthrow Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua. As the Sandinista march to victory gathered strength, Spadafora and the Victoriano Lorenzo Brigade were there. History found Spadafora marching toward Managua and the eventual victory of the Sandinistas alongside Commander Zero from the south. But Daniel Ortega and Tomas Borge in the main column of the Sandinistas were advancing from the other direction, and they beat Zero to Managua. That broadened the animosity between Aden Pastora and the rest of the Sandinista leadership. Spadafora was left on the short end. As the Americans began organizing the Nicaraguan Contras in the 1980s, Spadafora was there too. Spadafora worked with the Contras. As he also established arms-dealing contacts in Central America, inevitably he brushed shoulders with both the American establishment on one side and drug dealers on the other, both trading arms for drugs. At this point, Spadafora's intrigues already were a mixture of ideology and criminality, dependent only on the singular goal of making money. Having set up base in San Jose, Costa Rica, he made a slow transition from rebel fighter to businessman and wheel dealer. We maintained an active intelligence gathering operation in Costa Rica, both because it was a border country and because it had become spy central for various spy agencies. Spadafora was one of a number of Panamanians operating in Costa Rica about whom we received regular reports. He was not singled out for special observation, nor did we consider him a threat or a major player in the intrigues of Central America. The CIA also was hard at work gathering intelligence in San Jose. Our information indicated that the CIA did not take Spadafora as an important player either, but they did know what he was up to. Over time, Spadafora fashioned himself as my enemy and as a critic of the Panamanian Defense Forces. It was apparently because of a decision by the Panamanian Controller General to cut off Spadafora's longtime monthly cost of living stipend, which had begun during his days running the Panamanian Brigade for the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. That stipend amounted to roughly $2,000 a month, about what he earned in the mid-1970s after he got the job as Vice Minister of Health. Eventually, however, the Controller General's office objected, refusing to sign vouchers to pay rent for a new apartment Spadafora had set up in Panama City. Spadafora deeply resented this, considering it a personal affront, and started denouncing us. This was no ideological conversion or political decision. He was insulted and decided to seek revenge. Nevertheless, Spadafora came and went from Panama City to San Jose freely and frequently, without fear of harassment. His final fateful trip, however, came under circumstances still not understood. The 1993 murder trial in Panama on the Spadafora case showed the extreme doubt surrounding the case. I was named originally as a co-defendant, along with 9 other men. No evidence was presented against me at the trial, which took place in Chiriquí during the government of Guillermo Endara, the opposition leader made president by the Americans. The jury, despite political pressure, responded to the lack of evidence and acquitted 7 officers, including Major Luis Cordoba, with whom supposedly I was in touch during the murders. 2 military policemen from Chiriquí, Francisco Eliezer Gonzalez and Julio Cesar Miranda, were convicted and did confess to the crime. I was convicted in absentia, even though all of the officers who would have had to serve as my liaison if I were involved got off scot-free. Convicting me was obviously the result of political pressure, part of the syndrome of blaming me for anything that happened in Panama. In early September 1985, according to testimony at the trial, Spadafora suddenly decided to return to Panama. For unknown reasons, he went the long way, the difficult land route, instead of doing it the easy way, via scheduled airlines that fly from the mountain-ringed Costa Rican capital to the lush banks of the canal along the Pacific coast in less than 45 minutes. Spadafora's widow said her husband had received a phone call from Panama City, summoning him. "Get back here," was the message. "Very big and important things are about to happen." It later became clear that a coup was being planned against me, and the plotters wanted Spadafora's help. I could not have suspected that the death of Spadafora coincided with what was later revealed to be a half-baked plan by Diaz Herrera to raise a rebellion against me. The investigation into the death of Spadafora indicated that he traveled from the border by bus with Gonzalez. Witnesses said they saw the men travel together and share lunch in the town of Concepcion. Gonzalez, whom everyone called Bruce Lee, was an Indian, Asian in appearance, skilled in martial arts like his movie star namesake. He was one of a number of Indians from the local Guayme tribe who were on the local constabulary, an auxiliary branch of the defense forces. Spadafora's widow, Ariane Bejarano Acuna, testified before a Panamanian judicial investigation on January 6, 1986, that Hugo traveled to Panama under the name Ricardo Velázquez. My family, his friend Victoriano Morales, and a contact named Julio Valverde knew about his trip. Valverde had visited him one day earlier. Hugo decided to go on his trip to Panama on the morning of Thursday, September 12th. Walter Chavez and Jorge Beale had told him to be careful with Julio Valverde, that Julio had betrayed Hugo. At the trial, Gonzalez was silent while prosecutors described how the crime was committed. When it was his turn to speak during the reconstruction of events, he confessed. He took Spadafora to an isolated location, tied him up, and killed him. "I was there. I met him. We took the bus together." He testified without emotion. Neither did he say why he had committed the act. Also a defendant in the case was Lieutenant Colonel Luis Cordoba, the military commander in Chiriquí. He had been a loyal officer and probably believed at the time of the killing that he was protecting the military institution by hiding what he knew. As he sat there listening to the testimony, it dawned on him how much damage he had done by covering up Gonzalez's deed. So when Gonzalez was through, Cordoba broke his silence. He stared directly at Bruce Lee as he spoke, in a loud voice so the jury would hear every word. "My sin was that I knew what you had done, but I kept quiet about it," he said. "Up to this point, I protected you and was silent. I never accused you, but it's all over. I'm not helping you anymore. You're the one who did it, Bruce Lee. I never got an order to do this, and I never gave you one. You killed him. Tell them. Did I give you the order?" Bruce Lee looked away and said nothing. And that's the way it was left. Cordoba helped cover it up, fearing that the defense forces would be blamed, but neither received orders nor ordered nor participated in the crime. Years later, even after the 1993 trial was over and the murderer was identified, there still remained doubts. Was it a simple case of robbery? Was it a contract killing based on a double cross and an arms deal? Was it retribution stemming from the Central American Wars? No motive was ever revealed. There was one more defendant at the 1993 trial, a young captain named Mario Del Cid. Del Cid was found innocent of all charges. No relation to Luis Del Cid, my former aide. He was caught up in the Spadafora case. According to him, Diaz Herrera had invited him to join in the rebellion against me. When Del Cid refused, he said, Diaz Herrera took revenge by implicating him in the Spadafora murder. It was pure reprisal from Herrera, Del Cid said, but he remained in jail for 4 years before the case even went to trial. This series of events occurring in my absence gave birth to a web of lies. Out of nowhere, Major Garcia Piullo, the Panamanian attaché for police affairs in Costa Rica, extradited from Costa Rica a German man who claimed knowledge of the case. Speaking on national television, the German provided unusually detailed information about the Spadafora killing, and Diaz Herrera played him up as if he were the key to unraveling the entire case. But our investigators took a look at his claims and determined they were pure fabrication. The German disappeared from sight as quickly as he surfaced. Barletta, already in trouble with the leadership of our Democratic Revolutionary Party because of his plan to embrace IMF budget-cutting recommendations, now got involved in a constitutional dispute about whether he had the authority to convene a commission of inquiry about the Spadafora incident. I had completed my visit to Europe and flew finally to New York, where I had promised to meet with Barletta, who was preparing to attend the UN General Assembly. When I got to New York, we made several attempts to meet, but were thwarted by scheduling problems. Barletta and I both had meetings. He met on economic matters with Schultz and other officials. I met with foreign leaders, including Premier Felipe González of Spain. While something told me to stay in New York and talk to Barletta, my concern about the situation back home won out. It was nighttime when I got back to Panama City. At the arrival area at the military section of the airport, I found a group of legislators waiting for me, demanding Barletta's head. They were fed up and said the assembly wanted nothing more to do with him. Barletta arrived from New York the following day. He sent a helicopter to the airport and brought him directly to command headquarters for consultation. The meetings were in my office and lasted most of the day. Attending were Barletta, Jorge Abadia, the foreign minister, Colonel Marcos Justin, and Romulo Escobar Bethencourt. The proceedings were an airing of the situation and the charges. Barletta's responses were slow and deliberate. I was there to listen, serving as moderator for the discussions, which continued through lunch, occasionally extending outside my office, up and down the corridors outside. Barletta tried to debate the issue on a higher level, using economic and political reasoning. He mentioned neither Spadafora nor the investigations nor anything of the sort. He spoke about his future and his political support, and one thing stood out. If you people get rid of me, you'll be replacing me with Del Valle, a member of the oligarchy. You will certainly have no friends in his circle. You will be sorry if you get rid of me. Do you really want to replace me with the Rabi Blanco? Barletta asked rhetorically. Rabi Blanco, whitetail, was our slang term for the wealthy oligarchy in Panama. Are you sure about that? He said, arguing that he was still a viable president and the best insurance the PDF had. Time proved him right. It was clear that the Americans knew what was up. Halfway through the meeting, I received calls from both Nestor Sanchez at the National Security Council in Washington and from U.S. Ambassador Everett Briggs. Listen, Tony, Sanchez said, I hope you're not really going to dismiss Barletta. This is going to touch off lots of tremors back here. They're not going to like it. He was very conciliatory, not surprising since we had often worked together cordially on other issues. I can't say he was a friend because there are no friends in such matters, but I can say we had maintained good professional contacts in the past, when he was in the CIA and later at the State Department. Manuel Antonio, as your friend, I must tell you it will never be forgiven at the State Department. They will view it as if you had staged a coup. You are going to have problems, many, many problems as a result. Think about it. Think it over, he said. He didn't say any more, but he definitely had made his point. Briggs was more blunt. Barletta should be left alone. The U.S. ambassador was no friend, but he had been identified to me as more than an ambassador, a CIA contact as well. He said he was passing along a little free advice from Schultz himself. Don't do it, he said. Don't do it. I told both Sanchez and Briggs that it was impossible for me to keep Barletta as president. I tried to explain the domestic political atmosphere and the pressure for him to be ousted. Understanding none of this and disinterested in Panamanian politics, they didn't believe me. They saw this simply as my once again saying no and turning against them. Well into the afternoon, no one had budged in their positions. Barletta asked to speak to me in private. Everyone left, and he addressed me in the same friendly manner in which we always treated each other. Tony, can't you help me? Isn't there anything you can do? That's it, Nicky. There's nothing I can do, I said. You've heard how they all feel. The debate lasted for hours, but finally Barletta relented when he understood that our decision was firm. He announced his resignation. I undoubtedly could have used my influence to maintain Barletta in power, but the political cost would have been great. Everyone was lined up against him. 2 months after Barletta's dismissal in December 1985, I received a message from General Galvin, the head of the U.S. Southern Command, that John Poindexter, the president's chief of staff, would be making a stop in the former Canal Zone en route to elsewhere in Latin America. He wanted to meet me at Howard Air Base. I didn't know who Poindexter was or what his objectives for the meeting might be. I agreed to meet him, unaware that I was about to be subjected to one of the most arrogant, empty-headed performances ever staged by an American government official. Later, I found out that local CIA and U.S. military representatives at the U.S. Embassy had tried to brief Poindexter before our meeting, but that he had been disinterested. He didn't want reality or substance to interfere with what he had to say. "I am here representing President Reagan and George Shultz," he began, soon after we were ushered together into a meeting room at the airbase. Seated no more than 6 feet away from me, he puffed on a pipe and spoke coldly, his eyes never meeting my gaze. "By the end of this year, Barletta must be returned to power, and Panama must terminate its role in negotiating peace in Central America," he said. He sat there arrogantly, puffing away in a display of bad manners, wearing a loud, ugly sport jacket that seemed to fit his obnoxious demeanor. But his words were worse than the image he made. I remember being fascinated by the way that his eyes focused off at an angle the entire time he sat there, looking at some indistinct point in space. My aide, Lieutenant Moises Cortizo, did the translating for me, but was having trouble maintaining his composure. Panama should break relations or diminish relations with Cuba, as well as limit the Cuban presence in Panama. The Panamanian military doctrine is a bad ideological example for other armies in the region. On and on he talked, focusing on that imaginary point somewhere over my shoulder. Cortizo, a West Point graduate, and several other Panamanian officers present tried to catch the eye of the U.S. Embassy representatives in the room, who also looked away, probably wishing they were somewhere else. Even though Poindexter was not man enough to look at me, my gaze was fixed on him as he went through his tirade. Several times I had to stop Cortizo from allowing his indignation to boil over. He could hardly hold himself back. General Galvin, who had come along for the meeting, had to make sure that temper stayed under control. When Poindexter finished, I continued looking straight at him. I hardly knew how to take his rude, threatening, outrageously ill-mannered, disconnected performance. But I answered him. "You are a high-ranking official from Washington, but you are very much misinformed," I began. "Whatever information you think you have, your words are worthless. Your words and threats are an insult. The United States owes a debt to Panama and to me for the always respectful relationship we have enjoyed these many years. Leave, go back wherever you came from, but find out about Panama before you ever bother speaking to me again. Have somebody brief you on the truth of this relationship." Poindexter's startling performance made it clear that the U.S. relationship had changed drastically. Washington was hostile and incapable of dialogue. They wanted to dictate, and Panama was not responding the way they wanted. Now that Barletta was out, we were no longer compliant with U.S. policy. Panama was an outlaw regime. I had said no once too often. I could no longer be trusted. For our part, we started to miscalculate the Americans. We did not understand that the United States had become our enemy. We did not understand that the enemy would go to any lengths to control us, to destroy us.